So the way I've divided this topic is firstly, I would go over some core concepts, because those are very important with any development platform to know what is the philosophy of that platform. How does it view the domain of development activity? So we would go over certain concepts in that regard. Then some of the basic development objects, that when you're doing WMS development for BlueYonder, what are you going to be touching? What is available to be influenced? What are those objects? Then certain best practices. And then I would go over our development methodology, how we look at the DevOps problem domain with BlueYonder WMS, and how do we think it applies, and how do we address those concepts. And then we would have Q&A afterwards. So first, some of the core concepts. So this particular slide is something which is part of and is going to be part of every discussion we do about BlueYonder. This slide is from the documentation, and is something which is part of the documentation since 90s. So that speaks volumes about the sophistication of the architecture and how it views the problem, and well ahead of the curve in that it always viewed the problem as something where the clients would be requesting services from the backend, and that Mocha is the application server layer, and all access is through Mocha. So every service is accessed via Mocha, and that is how the various types of problems are addressed. So this is a very important concept, so that this is front and center when we are talking about development with BlueYonder WMS. So then just looking at, once you install BlueYonder WMS, then what is it that you are looking at? So what BlueYonder looks at their installation footprint as a collection of sub-products, you can say. So for example, they view Mocha as kind of a product, and MCS, which is Mocha Client Services, as a product, reporting as a product. DCS is basically the product for which represents the WMS. So that is also a product. So that is how they view the installation footprint, that you are basically installing a bunch of quote unquote products. And within that same, parallel to them, is a folder called LES, which stands for Logistics Execution Systems. So that is the some place where you put in any customization. So when you're doing development activity, whether you're doing it as a customer, as a implementer, or even if you are a BlueYonder's own consulting arm, you are always putting stuff in LES. All the others are not something which you should be ever touching. Some rollout, some hot fixes may come occasionally from BlueYonder, which may patch certain files in other folders, but that is basically the installation footprint. And each one of those folders, if you open DCS folder, for example, you would see a very similar directory tree that I am showing on the right side. So it is, again, speaking volumes about the elegance of the overall footprint, that everything is the same, and that is a very important aspect of this whole thing. And then what you are doing is basically putting in stuff in the LES, and that is how the problem is solved. Just as I described, SAL stands for Shared Application Layer, MCS for MQ Client Services, MTF for Mobile Terminal Framework, but each one of them, BlueYonder considers them as kind of like a product, and then it has the same directory tree underneath it. So now we know that if we installed it, what are we getting, and where would we be putting in any development objects under the hood. So next comes in that if we are going to do any development activity, what are the choices I have in terms of language that I would speak to BlueYonder, right? So in that, you have generally two domains. One is the interpreted languages domain and the compiled language domain. In terms of interpreted, Mocha has its own proprietary language, and that is available, of course, and that works very nicely with SQL embedded inside it. So that is one option. In the same domain, you have Groovy as well. So Groovy is something which people who are familiar with would know is very similar to Java, but that is going to be in the interpreted domain, that you just can write it and it runs. And then on the compiled side, you have option of writing code in Java, and you can do traditional C as well. And you can use .NET, but that is not encouraged. So that is the general framework of what the language choices are. And then Groovy is something which is very interesting, because that gives you essentially the same capabilities, even down to the performance, as you would get with a compile, because they have a very sophisticated framework where Groovy is kind of interpreted, but it is just in time compiled. So you would, at the end of it, over the long term, you would see almost the same performance that you would get with 3GL code. So for business problems, I would say that if you just stuck with the left side, interpreted language domain, and used Groovy where it belongs, you would never have to go to the compiled language route. So that is generally our own methodology, that we would always try to solve the problem using the left side, and the right side is only in rare exceptions that we ever have to go there. So now just one classic problem that I wanted to discuss. This would be, if you're familiar with BlueYonder, you know that already, but then if you're using SAP, JD Edwards, any packaged application which allows some form of customization. So this is like a textbook problem, that if you are going to modify standard behavior, how should you go about approaching it? So oftentimes the default answer is that I would take the standard business service component, whatever it is, business function, copy it as a custom, and I modify the custom, and yeah, I am now good, right? But that is a fallacy. That is not really the default right answer, because as soon as you did it, well, what about the tens of places where that standard component was being called from? Well, we have a problem there. Similarly, what if the standard behavior was changed with a bug fix or enhancement? Well, we have a problem, right? So again, then the opposite answer is that I would customize the standard code in place and appropriately document and whatnot, so I can retrofit it later on. So again, that is something which we have to understand as something which the problem always existed, right? But it speaks volumes that of BlueYonder WMS is probably one of the few which solves this problem elegantly, keeping in mind both sides of the picture, that how to preserve customizations and also get the standard behavior. So that's something which I wanted to lay out there as a classic problem. And then how is it solved? So how is it solved is that BlueYonder has a concept of component levels, right? So generally speaking, if you have a function or something like that, it should only exist in one place. That is where you come with that do I modify the standard or do I customize it? Because you generally assume that if I have a service called creating order, there should be only one object which represents it. But in case of BlueYonder WMS, because they understood this problem early on, what they say is that every component or business service, whatever you want to use, exists in a level. And you can have as many levels as you want, and the higher the number, the more customized it is. So for example, 9,000 would customize 700 in our example that listed here. So what they say is that any business service, any component, can exist in multiple levels, and when it is invoked, it is always invoked from the highest level. So there goes the idea that you don't have to, if you want something to be customized, you just implement it with the same exact name at a higher level, and now you are going to call the customize. So that solves half the problem, that okay, if anything that already exists that's calling it is handled. But then what about the other part, that how do I invoke the standard behavior more elegantly? More elegantly has two parts. Maybe you don't even have the source code of the base functionality. So there, what they have is a syntax where you put a caret in front of a command, and then you are basically saying, well, call it from the lower level. So that's a very elegant way of saying it. So and you can see this example. This example is from BlueYonder's own code, right? So what they said that, okay, we want to be able to print reports. So there is an MCS reporter level, which is providing the lowest level service possible, which would just go and generate the report, no bells and whistles about it. It would go and call your Jasper report or traditional Mocha server report and call it, right? So then there is a little bit higher level called shared application layer cell. There they basically enhanced it a little bit. They said, well, I want to call the same one, but I want to provide the functionality of digital signatures. So again, what they did is, okay, you call the base one and support the digital signature if it applies. And then further up, the DCS product customized it further and said, well, I want to be able to get printers in a more elegant way with the override printer concept and whatnot. So they override it further. So that shows that how this concept is employed by BlueYonder themselves and how elegantly it works. Now, if the, for example, those who are familiar with BlueYonder, when things change from Mocha traditional report writer to Jasper, only the lowest level is changing. Higher levels remain the same. And similarly, we have often customized this even further. For example, one of our customers wanted to do a daily trend for whenever a report is printed. So again, what are we doing? We are creating a further up level of it and doing our custom behavior there. So that is a very elegant way of solving that classic problem. So now if anything which is calling the standard service still works, if you get a enhanced behavior on the core level, that still you get, and that should be basically front and center when we are doing any customization, that we should take advantage of this concept to its fullest. So component level, the fundamental design principle, it should always be there. So we would always influence what needs to be influenced, and then go from there. And we would always analyze the base code and then go from there. And the basic basic approach should be that we would always try to influence the standard behavior, keeping input and output the same. So that is something which is very important in this regard. So triggers are another very interesting concept, in again keeping in mind the idea that when we're talking about business applications, you often have to influence things a little bit. So what triggers basically says that how you call the component and what it returns would remain the same, but if you want to just get some additional effect, you can do that with triggers. Example could be that when this thing happens, you want to log a daily trend. When this thing happens, you want to maybe print a report as well. When this thing happens, you want to maybe send data to another system. So those are common requirements in terms of what we want to do. And triggers are the best way to achieve that, because when you put a trigger on a command, only thing we have to take care of is make sure that it doesn't raise an exception in a known business case. Otherwise, we can be comfortable that by adding a trigger, we are not going to break compatibility with anything that exists. So if we are going to log an event to go send data someplace, we can absolutely be sure that the caller is not going to break because of that effect that we are introducing because of it. So again, that is a very elegant way. And then it is also possible to override standard triggers. You would basically disable the standard and put your own. So all of that is available with this trigger technique. Another common thing is that you might want to verify certain data and raise an error. Again, it might be a valid business use case for standard product, but maybe you want to put a check in there that you don't never want data be in a certain way. That is another place where triggers could come in handy. So triggers are again a very useful tool in your domain in terms of what you can do to influence the software. So with that background, that basically is describing how the back end looks like in terms of Mocha. What are our basic tools available? We have component levels, we have components can live in multiple levels, we can override them, and then we have triggers. So that basically is your core set of tools that you have available in order to do the customization. So now I'm going to go over a little bit more deeper as to what are the development objects. First and foremost, you have the database itself. And again, it's a business application. So yes, it is very extensive, but you always are getting some new columns, for example, on order that you need to park for some reports, or maybe echoing back to the host system. So there are certain design principles that we have to understand with respect to the database. Most important is the naming convention. All we need to make sure the BlueYonder is generally is a bit promiscuous in this level, that it does not mind custom database tables to appear in its database. It does not mind custom columns to appear in a standard table. So it has a general promiscuity that it would allow in that regard. So that should be the general idea that we we should not overcomplicate a problem. Overthink is if we need to create a custom table, it is fair. We can do it. And again, we can add custom columns if it is per the methodology, it is fair. The only thing is that the custom table should have a USR prefix and or UC prefix or VC, or and then custom columns same way. As long as we are keeping with that methodology, we are fine. We should understand that it by default can support multiple measuring units like imperial versus metric. And the core concept is that all data is stored in the database in a base unit. So that concept is very important. So for example, by default, all the mass data, weight data is stored in ounces. So which means that if you're going to create a custom screen, that is fair. Custom column, all fair. But what is not going to be right is that you put in the weight in database table in pounds. Now you have violated some core principle. All weights everywhere should be in one unit. All dimensions should be in one unit in the database. Presentation layer is different. So that is something which is very fundamental. Again, internationalization is at the core of the product. So if you're doing any customizations, let's not break that purity. So if you're making so yes, you might be making a report for only one locale, but it's a good idea to keep those concepts pure, and that you utilize the appropriate techniques to make sure that all of the tags and everything like that is internationalization. And when we are creating new components, we should follow the same methodology of the naming conventions. We must avoid stored procedures and triggers. There's oftentimes, if there is a learning gap, sometimes folks rush to the stored procedures and triggers. That is an absolute no. Let's not do that. And in the cloud environment, you would absolutely not be able to do that. In the other environments, you can do that, but let's avoid it. And then a SQL, if you're going to write the SQL, we should always write for ANSI, but then Mocha would convert Oracle SQL to the SQL server version as well. So if you're going to write something which is a little bit nuanced, like NVL function or something like that, it's the best idea, even if you might be SQL Server only shop, to write it to the Oracle syntax and then let Mocha convert it. Those are the basic design principles. Another very important concept that we are talking about generally any business application is this divide between how is the logic represented. Is it data driven or is it code driven, right? So that's again classic approach distinction. So code is where you're writing actual code, like if, then, while, loop, all those kind of stuff to represent your business problem. So in that case, Mocha's own language, MTF, C#, JavaScript, these are some of the examples of how you write code to get your end result. But then data-driven is also something which is quite elegant. It provides its own advantages, and BlueYonder does utilize that. For example, integrator is all data to do your transformations of data. And DDA's data-driven application is also all data-based. And then we have MCS, which was a traditional client services configuration. That's all database as well. So code is very easy to deploy because all you have to do is just put the code in the next one and you're done. Data has its own unique challenges, which I would cover a little bit later as to how we addressed it. But that is certainly easier to develop, but it has certain challenges in terms of deployment. And then they're hybrid as well. Like if you are going to make a RF change, it is generally code, but you do have entries in a table that you have to put in to indicate where your object is going to be. Similarly, the convert table or alias cust table on cust field table as well. So there is this is basically just wanted to call out the data driven versus code driven. How is that applied to BlueYonder? It does apply, and code is generally easy to deploy, but it has a little bit more learning curve. Data is easy to develop in, but it has a deployment challenge. But that is basically the given picture that we have in this regard. So then the question comes in, okay, I know about the components. I know there's stuff which is data driven. I know which is stuff which is code driven, but what can I really customize? So the answer there is everything, right? Everything can be customized. There is nothing which you are unable to do fundamentally at the core level. So everything will be customized, but then generally our approach should always be to start from the lowest level because that gives you the biggest bang for the buck. So if, for example, you are going to have a specific requirement around order creation, that when an order is of this type, then this field should be set this way, right? So sure, you could get the business requirement that when I get an order integration, it should be like this. but you should then translate it to the no, I'm going to modify the core API, create order, maybe hang a trigger on it or something like that to implement that requirement. And then you get that functionality on every higher level. So if you modify the command, then you're getting it in integration and front end automatically. So that should be the general approach. Again, business would always give the requirement in terms of their use cases. Then we as analysts have to look at that, what would be the right place to modify. So generally our approach should be do it at the Mocha level, because that's the simplest and it's global. The next up, integrations, of course, can be customized. That might be a requirement as well. Reports and labels should always rely on Mocha commands. Let's avoid putting inline SQLs. That would give us a little bit better overall solution. RF can be customized. Web front end can be customized as well. That's a newer technology, but again, in terms of what can be done, it can be done. So it hurts me to use the word legacy, because this was a very sophisticated concept, but unfortunately it is legacy because these are on their way out. But DDAs, MCS configuration, and custom fields were again very elegant concepts, but those could all be again customized if we wanted to. So then, so now we know what can be customized. So next question then is, how would those customizations get deployed into the forward or higher environments? So there, the technique is called rollout, that you create a rollout. Either it is done manually or automatic. That is up to the tools and available solutions that you have. But that is the right way of getting environment data into the higher environments. And with BlueYonder Cloud, that would be the only way. So in the previous version, you could have cheated a little bit and just copied the objects, so to say, in the new environment. But now, as of BlueYonder Cloud, the only way is to do a rollout. Fundamentally, rollout can cover data and code. So again, the BlueYonder considers them to be same in terms of the deployment problem. So your rollout could have integrated data in it. It could have CSV files that are loaded into certain tables. It could have DDLs for making database changes. All of that would be in a rollout that you would deploy into the next environment. So that is basically a summary of what are the development objects and what can we do with them. So now I would go over certain best practices in this regard. So first best practice, which many times is missed, and we want to make sure that it is not missed. And that's true for any packaged application, but specifically for BlueYonder WMS. So let's understand that at a 50,000 foot view, this system is almost the same as it was in 90s. So that speaks volumes about the concepts which are in this system. So right, when you are implementing a very sophisticated enhancement, maybe you're putting robotics in, you're putting an MHE system in, you're putting other systems in like transportation management system, you're not changing anything fundamentally in the BlueYonder WMS. Its concepts lend themselves very nicely and very elegantly to those enhancements. So we must never rush to development. So the project should not start, hey, I'm getting this MHE system, this is the integration spec, go at it. That would be the wrong way to approach the problem. We should always do what like a proof of concept, a pilot or something like that, using the standard concepts, work with the business to say these are the standard concepts which we are going to influence with our change. And that is how the project should proceed always. We should never rush to the development activity. And there should be a little bit of a back and forth. There should be a challenge. Okay, this standard screen exists. Why would we not use it? And fair answer would be to say that maybe it's too labor intensive. Maybe it's too complicated for the users to use. Those are all fair answers. But then we would know that this is the standard concept, and we are simply making a enhancement to the standard concept to make it simple, or maybe we would be stringing 3 standard concepts together and doing it that way. So though that's all good. Tracing is a very important aspect of the whole analysis, because tracing would reveal the underlying components that are being called, and that would form the foundation of what we are going to do as an enhancement. And we should generally try to avoid as much as possible the front end level development, because those are the hardest in terms of retrofit effort. For example, changing the RF or web front end. Net new screens might be a little bit easier, but when you're trying to influence existing ones, there might be a little bit of challenge, but again, if it's a requirement, it's a requirement. But if we change in the lower level first, for example, if the requirement is that if this thing happens, users needs to see an error, that must not be done at the front level, front end if possible. What we should do is the underlying component should detect that condition and raise an error, and the user would elegantly see that error condition. So that should be the general approach. Try to and do analyze first, and then try to solve problem at the lowest level if possible. So, and when we're talking about lower levels, then don't go below Mocha under any situation. That is absolute no in terms of what we should even think about. So going that is only going to give you grief, and for good reason cause you support concerns as well. Because Mocha is what BlueYonder thinks is the lowest level things are going. When they look at a trace, they think that that's the only thing that is happening. So nothing should be happening below it. And we should try to enhance the lower levels. We should avoid inline SQL in reports and labels. It's very easy to create Mocha commands, so it's often better to create a service, because that also lends itself to reusability, because maybe the same command could be used in reports and labels. Integrations also should utilize Mocha commands. And there is some tool in your back pocket that you can rely on in case of very acute problems, something called a Mocha hooks. So, for example, Mocha has a very elegant hook where you can rewrite a SQL statement. So we have used it in certain acute situations where, for example, a performance was very bad for a specific SQL, or there was a syntax error that the SQL was revealing in certain situations. So this hook is available. So you can very easily say that if the SQL is like this, it sees the version which is with the bind variables, and you can then transform it to a different SQL. But that should never be the approach of doing an enhancement. That is something which can come in handy for a very difficult problems in terms of performance, where the code might be in a component which we don't have the source code for. So that is available in those specific situations. So then certain best practices, and they're also documented on my blog post. You can refer to them there as well. That overriding is better. There I would say is that the standard product, if it is working a certain way, we should always try to influence it, right? That is so rather than saying that I don't like how the standard product works and I'm going to fundamentally change it and do it better. Sure, you might find a better way of doing it, but that is not the right way. For example, classic example is that item master in Red Prairie, it replicates its warehouses to for every warehouse that exists. So if you have 100,000 items, if you have 20 warehouses, sure, you have created 2 million item master records. Whether we like it or not, that is how BlueYonder WMS views item master. So we must not try to bend over backwards to say that, oh, I don't like the 2 million rows, so I'm going to try to change the standard behavior. That should be given, and we are going to work with that. So if we just keep that purity in mind, that we are working with a standard solution and we are going to just maybe override the behavior, then we would be overall in better shape. If we start creating parallel competing concepts, then we are only going to get into trouble later on. Avoid writing 3GL code if possible. Again, we have been doing this for a long time. It is very rare that we ever had to go to Java or C level. With Mocha's own language and Groovy, you can always do stuff in those interpreted languages. So that should be the default answer, and go to the lower levels in a very, very acute problem. So if you currently go to your source code and source libsource varint and source libsource userint, those are your biggest enemies in terms of retrofitting when you are going to go into the next version. So let's try to keep this to absolute minimum or zero. It should be your real answer, that these folders would have 0 files in them. Do not overuse policies. So oftentimes, sometimes we are creating a customization and we just go nuts with policies. Okay, this everything I want to make customization, so I would make a policy. So I did something good, right? The thing is that then when you do an upgrade, then nobody can keep these policies straight, that what policy was created for what thing. So many times custom columns are better option than policies, because then you can expose that concept very elegantly to the business user and it is easy to document. So overuse of policy is also something which should be avoided. And then Groovy is your friend. So again, don't try to write code in C and Java, write it in Groovy. And also Mocha's own language sometimes is not very elegant to solve complex problems. So there too, Groovy is something which is your friend. So you utilize Groovy to its best. So documentation is another thing which is something where often we get it wrong. So there is a classic problem in terms of documentation where it is the what versus why. So what is that this particular business function, component, integration, or whatever, what is it, right? So that kind of information belongs in the artifact itself, right? That information, that what is that I'm looking at create order right now in my user end, it is customized. What is that overall philosophy behind this? That information belongs in that artifact. That information does not belong in a Word document in a folder someplace. So that is where we get it wrong. And again, Mocha recognized this problem early on. You have a very rich set of tags available within the command for documentation, for doing C also, input, output, all that kind of stuff. What policies are referenced, why, what are the exceptions are going to be raised. Again, very elegant way of describing what a command is in there. So we should utilize those and not leave that what in some Word document someplace, because that Word document is kind of useless when time has passed. Integration documentation, same way. Integration is a data-driven solution. So we know at the database level that this field is what and why. So that information belongs in integration metadata itself, and it can be generated from there. So there too, we should not say that, okay, this is my integration map. Now I'm going to copy that into an Excel sheet and put it someplace, because that would be useless very quickly, because that's going to be basically obsolete very quickly. And unit of design, what is that? Then specification is in the command itself. The why is that if this create order component evolved over time, it had 3 or 4 or 5 iterations, why did that happen? That belongs in the version control system. Again, that also belongs in the version control system. Your artifact, like a bigger picture of the create order, if it's beyond the command declaration, that could be in a separate artifact if possible. But we must not have a series of them. To know the evolution of a component, it belongs in the version control. So that is why it is very important to make sure that if documentation is not useful, then it is just a burden. So we need to make sure that documentation is useful. And there too, even though technologically we should generally be not too much influenced by that, but Word documents are really not a good unit to represent software over time. So that is generally going to cause more burden than solution. So some advanced concept like Confluence pages with tags is a much better way of representing software over time. So that is generally a better thing. So now I would go over that, okay, what is our view, SmartEye's view of solving these problems? How do we approach actual enhancement with BlueYonder WMS, and how would we do DevOps kind of a philosophy? How do we implement it? So first and foremost, we always spend time with a proof of concept or pilot, whatever we call it. Whatever enhancement we are doing, we would always start with that. So what does it mean? If we are introducing an MHE system, we would say, okay, MHE system is nothing more than a system which is mimicking an RF user doing the same kind of picking. Okay, we would say, okay, we will set up some dummy areas and everything like that. Okay, this is what we are talking about. Picks get released. This is what the person used right now. You are really just talking about not using this RF screen, and we are going to instead get a message, right? So that is fundamental. So it could take maybe sometimes 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or in certain cases, it might just be a 1-hour meeting where we just all parties involved agree on what we are talking about. And that must be always the first step before anything is done. And the way would present a concept that how the user is doing it, and this is what is going to be implemented in the system. And we get the buy-in from the business on that proof of concept. Now, whatever the requirements were upfront, they should be represented in that pilot or proof of concept and say that everybody agrees, because the requirements may have come before knowing even what BlueYonder WMS is capable of. So this becomes then the source of truth for the next step. And then during this, of course, we can do traces and stuff like that. We can do a little bit of prototyping as well, so that we have some help for the next phase. But we always start with this phase in every project. Then when we actually get to the development, we want to avoid reinventing a wheel or reinventing a better wheel. So many of these problems are already solved for decades. So we always say that issue tracking system is a must for any development work we are going to do. There are free tools available like Bugzilla, or you can use Jira. So all of them are nice tools. You must always have a way to track what you are going to do in the system. And then version control system is also just a fundamental, step zero. We should not be even thinking about developing unless we have a version control system. Again, we have free tools available like SVN, or you can use GitHub TFS or any of those things. So these should be fundamental. So we should not even approach development activity until we have those. And then we should understand fundamentally that for BlueYonder WMS, code is as important as data. So we must have a good solution of an understanding of how the data is handled. And then documentation should be fundamentally in the commands itself. So with data, it is very important to understand that data is also cumulative. For example, just imagine if you have a create order component, it might have gone through 5 iterations, but if you look at that MCMD file, you see what it is there. So it is cumulative view of everything that has happened to it. Unfortunately, what we often see is that with data, folks don't do that. For data, for example, I would see 10 different files under policies, all representing the same policy, that this was the version 1, version 2, version 3. So sometimes we lose that abstraction. So we must say that, no, data is equal to code. When I look at its view under mload, I should be seeing the cumulative. This is what it is today. And again, just like for create order, to see the story behind it, I went to version control. Here too, I should go to version control for that. And it would be a good idea to invest in better tools upfront to gather requirements and test cases and whatnot. Word documents in a folder is probably not the best solution available to do any software development lifecycle management. So in this, some tools that we have developed to support this DevOps picture is that one is that we want to avoid going at the file system to do anything. So we have this screen that we always create called issue assignment. The idea is that we have already created a Jira item or a Bugzilla item that this is what I want to do. Now I understand to do that I might be obtaining data or code, but that is all mixed together. So I would just say that I'm working on this issue, and in the issue ID, I would put the Jira item or the Bugzilla number. And then I just go start making my changes as I need. I can change code, I can change integrator objects, I can change policies, DDAs, whatever I need to do. And this backend is tracking everything I'm doing. And at the end, I simply say I completed. So the whole overhead of keeping track of the changes disappears. We just do this, we complete it, and it goes into the version control system at that level. So with data, just so that we know that how we approached the problem of data so that we can handle it in this model, is that first of all, there's a problem with deleting. So sometimes your enhancement might be to delete a certain policy or delete a certain artifact. So that what we do is we upfront create a folder called user OSSI delete. So mload is a quite elegant construct where it is processing a CSV file. So what we do is that our mload script in this folder is deleting a primary key. So that's what we are doing. So it is compatible with the whole rollout framework, but that's what we do. That's how we would handle deletes. And for integrations is another problem where typically people would have either export the whole integrated data ball or something like that. But we create these folder structures on the right under this user OSSI SL-EXP. And that is how we solve the integration problem, so that when we are going to change a particular event, it would just export that one event in the proper folder. And that is the object which is checked in. So that's how we can do incremental changes over time. Another problem which has been introduced over the last few versions is that certain objects in BlueYonder have now started to use identity primary key concept. So that looks good on paper, but then when you try to move such objects from a lower environment to the higher environment, then you get into trouble, because your location type you might have created in the lower environment might be 3, but you might already have 3 in production for some other change. So that becomes very difficult to move such objects up to a new environment, pick lists and other example and stuff like that. So the way we handle it is that we always create the CSV files without the sequence, and then we always include the name in it, and then we use the underlying components in our mload scripts to move it to the new environment. So that's how we have addressed that problem. So overall, again, we are trying to say that data can be represented just in a cumulative fashion, and we can check in and make part of the rollout as we want. So this is describing how we view the integrator. So if I look at, for example, the event folder, I would see files there for every event. And if I look inside it, I would just see that event and its event argument. So again, when I made the change to an integrator and I committed it, what I committed is just that one event and its argument. So again, a very micro view so that we can do changes as we see fit later on. So then another thing that which has been introduced over last few releases is that we have refs, front-end objects as well, which could be actual customization like resource bundles, or they might be pages, menus, menu items, and that kind of stuff. So how we address that problem is that we have this overarching concept that your version control repository is one, your rollout is one. So that like you would, whether it's a refs change or a other change, it would always be checked in the same place, and it would always be rolled out using the same mechanism. So to implement that vision, what we have is that we have mload scripts for even the refs objects. And what those mload scripts do is they take that CSV view and convert it into the YAML representation, and then that is what is loaded. So that's how we view the refs object. So again, when we are deploying even refs objects, they would be checked in and deployed using the same framework. For messages, you don't see messages in this. Our general idea is that we say that we would still create the messages in LES MLS cat. And then what we do is that when we are deploying any rollout, we always take any customized message in LES MLS cat and we create a portal entry for that as well. So they are always 100% in sync. So that is the general overarching philosophy is still the same code base. It's still the same rollout, but we would still be compatible with the YAML concepts and everything like that at the mload layer. So next is that the story about an artifact is told by the version control and not by a series of Word documents, not by, you know, those long comments with every change, you know, this is this PR number, this is this PR number. No, not none of that. Code should be clean, crisp, cumulative view, and over time, like I'm showing you a snapshot that this particular component has been changed, move inventory has been changed so many times. That story belongs in version control, and for each one of them, it is telling me the Bugzilla number. I can go to that Bugzilla. It would have the attached documents, attached discussions, attached email notes, so I can see the story behind it, that how did it happen. I can see the incremental changes of each move inventory, so I know where a certain change was introduced. So all of that, so that why belongs in a version control system and not a series of Word documents, not some obnoxious comments in the code. All of that is there, and the what is going to be command documentation within it. So again, as you can see, this move inventory, you can put very elegant the documentation there. So we should utilize that to its fullest. And the data is no different. Okay, same story which we said about code belongs to data. So the top is a particular event. It has changed over time. So again, the same thing. What I see there in that SLEXP file is cumulative view of what it is today. And then its story of evolution belongs in the version control. Even a policy, that is the lower screenshot, same idea, that policy is changed over time. So that story belongs in the version control. But what I see in the mload is that one policy checked in. So that is generally the philosophy, how we are going to approach the problem domain. So in terms of Git is a very popular tool. So this solution works with Git as well. So in case of Git, what we do is we simply create a webhook in Git, which would push this information to another service in the cloud. And that is how we can support this whole idea, what I'm describing with SVN Jira, with SVN and Bugzilla, can also work with a Git Jira framework as well. So once all of that is done, all of the guesswork is taken out of creating a rollout. Again, the left side is from Bugzilla, where we can create a rollout and we can just get the bug numbers. On the right side is from Jira, where we can give a bunch of Jira items, and the repository is in Git. So all of that works seamlessly. There is no guesswork involved. The person who is building a rollout does not have to be the same person as the developer, does not even have to be a developer in their job description even. All they need to know is that this is the objects and this is the rollout I'm creating, and it should work every time predictably and reliably. Mocha architecture is very sophisticated. It handles some of the classic problems very well, and it provides a change, addresses the issue of changing standard behavior as well. That should be our default place for making any customization, should be the Mocha architecture layer, and try to influence an existing command if possible. That is the best approach, or you can customize it as well, or make custom concept. Avoid custom concepts at all cost. Code versus data, again, its line is a little bit blurry in case of BlueYonder WMS, but it's best to look at that with abstraction to say code is data in terms of how our artifacts are going to be managed. It's very important to institute best practices. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Version control, issue tracking system, all of that should be fundamental step zeros, and that is how we should start to approach the development approach. And then smartized methodology is just one view of implementing that philosophy, that idea. You can have competing concepts as well. You could build something yourself as well, but that philosophy should be respected at those levels. So at this time, it would be open to Q&A. If you guys have any questions, feel free to show them. There's one question which was sent to us, was that would you adopt a full DevOps model? So DevOps is not a tool. So the DevOps is a philosophy, right? So we were kind of married into the philosophy of DevOps before even the word was invented. So much of those tools that we have described are all more than a decade old, right? So that's something that we have been very much invested in. So DevOps basically says that I should be able to make a very streamlined view of taking objects into the new environments in a mechanical fashion and whatnot. So all of the tools that I've described in smartized methodology are all have the same philosophy. So I would say that yes, those tools are very much in line with the DevOps philosophy, and are basically implementing the same thing in BlueYonder space. And then there is a question from Jawad about how do we know that the use of hook is now inevitable? So again, general answer there is some of it would be, so its performance is basically the basic. I guess even before performance is, if you run into a certain issue where the standard code has a syntax error, right? So your use case you cannot even finish, and we have seen that as well. In certain cases that would happen, and taking a hot fix is out of the question. So that would be the one reason that you have to get this use case to work. So you could certainly do SQL query override and write your own SQL in place. That is certainly one option. The second is extreme performance issues. So with the first one, what happens is that there are certain nuances which I would cover in the next performance tuning one as well. That Mocha does something called auto binding. So sometimes what happens is the SQL has a syntax error with the bind variables, but when you run it again, it runs fine. So user never saw any issue, but you are paying a performance penalty. So that would be another reason where a hook could come in. We have actually saw it. So we have seen it in certain situation, and we solved it with the hook. And then there is a acute performance issue where you cannot come up with any solution other than the query has to be rewritten a certain way. So you could certainly rewrite it. But there too, the first option should be to use database techniques, which you would cover in the next presentation. But if all of that has failed, then you have this tool in your back pocket that you can certainly use it, and it is there. It works quite elegantly, and we have actually abstracted it a little bit as well. What we do is that we just put the source query and the destination query in a file, and then we it just does it automatically. So there is very little overhead in using it. It is implemented quite well by Mocha. So when we tested it, that if we are doing a query level override, there is extremely negligible overhead. So all of those are good, but we should never just default that for a customization. So that should be something which we should avoid at all cost. And getting a fix from Retray is always the better option.